Hi, and welcome everybody to the latest CTO Craft Bytes. Today we're enjoying a talk from Milan Thacker. If it's your first time here at CTO Craft Bytes, I'll tell you a little bit more about the group. So CTO Craft is a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders, and it's all around the world now. So Milan is joining us from USA, Massachusetts, did we say? Yeah.
That's correct.
So it focuses on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. Community members are 8,000 plus now probably, and it provides them with one-to-one coaching, mentoring groups, and a curated Slack group, which I can really recommend. I've got some great conversations on there, and events like this one. So if you're not a member already, I've posted a few links in the Slack in the message channel. So please do have a look. Okay. And before we get started, I just want to say a big thanks to our sponsor partners for helping these events happen. So partners like AWS, Google Cloud, O'Reilly, and Pentag, amongst others. So if you're not a member already, have a look and join up because there's some great benefits to have from those. But mainly a big thank you to Jellyfish for sponsoring this event in particular. So my name's Anna Dick. I'm currently VP of Engineering at a company called Lunio. I'm about 6 weeks in now, I think. So Lunio have a great MarTech product that really helps convert wasted ad spend into growth revenue. So check it out. But most importantly, we've got Milan joining us today. Milan's a product manager at Jellyfish. Milan, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So nice to meet all of you. Thank you all for being willing to spend time with us today. Like Anna said, I'm Milan. I'm one of the product managers here at Jellyfish. I've spent the last 4 years at Jellyfish ever since we were, a tiny startup with 9 people, working with engineering and product leaders like yourselves, helping them understand how to measure their teams in times of plenty, like we had for the last few years, and also in macroeconomic conditions like we're under now, where helping teams build their metric strategy, helping teams understand what they should measure and what they're going to get out of it, and most importantly, helping them craft a story around that to make sure that they can help the rest of the business have transparency into what's going on within kind of the black box of engineering and product, as it sometimes feels like.
That's great, thank you. And just before we get started, we're going to run this fairly informal kind of fireside question and answer. I think if anybody has got any questions, then we've got an ask a question section as we go. I'll kind of monitor it as we go through. If there's anything specifically relevant to what we're talking about, we'll probably pick it up at that time. If not, we're going to leave some time at the end as well. Okay, Milan, this is a really great topic, especially in this climate. So I'm really excited to talk to you about this a little bit more. Do you want to give us a little summary of the topic that you want to cover today?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we all know we've been living in kind of these macroeconomic times of plenty up until probably early last year, mid last year. And now that we're in a little bit more macroeconomic uncertainty, it's even more critical to make data-driven decisions during this climate. It's hard to do that, though. It's hard to have actionable insights. It's hard to make those strategic decisions. Sometimes we're, making guesses, finger in the wind type stuff, trying to talk to as many people as we can, which we don't have all the time in the day to do. And it's hard to identify which data matters and what decisions you should make on that data. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about what metrics you should be tracking as your team's KPIs or key performance indicators as you kind of go through the shift from a growth to an efficiency mindset. So I'm going to focus on things that provide both continuous value to customers and the business. And we're going to talk about how you can use this to provide some transparency into the engineering teams, to other stakeholders in your organization, and empower you to make kind of sound business decisions during this really volatile period where you're sometimes worried about budget and worried about making the right decision.
Great. And I think it's brilliant that working at Jellyfish, you're obviously working with lots of different customers as well. Mm-hmm. So that insight that you're getting back, that feedback is obviously not just one company, but many as well, probably many different types of companies too, which is great.
Yeah, I have the fortune of having seen it done really well a lot of places, and I can just copy that. And I've seen it where it hasn't worked necessarily as well, and we can always learn from those things.
Yeah, great. Okay. All right, cool. So how should teams think about measuring engineering efficiency, and how granular do you think this should be when relaying this to stakeholders?
Yeah, I almost like splitting this into two questions, right? There's engineering efficiency, and that's what you as the CTO or VP of engineering kind of care about within the team, right? And bluntly, it's a lot of times the stakeholders, unless they're like a product team that's pretty close to the engineering team, don't really care about the engineering efficiency. They care about two things. What are you working on? And when is it going to be done? And when can I sell it to my customers? And efficiency and making sure that you're efficient actually kind of falls into both categories. Efficiency is all about, are we working on the most important stuff? Like, where are we spending our time and effort? Are we spending it on things that we're doing to grow the business? Are we spending it on things that we're doing to sustain engineering? Or are we spending time and effort on dealing with our customers who are giving us lots of bugs or finding lots of problems with our product? And that's number one. And thing number two is, here's how we're getting it done as quickly as possible. Stakeholders probably don't care about story point velocities or making sure that you're merging all of the PRs or merging your PRs quickly. But what they do care about is the project going to get done in a time that I can sell it, or am I waiting 3 months, 6 months until I can actually start bringing this thing to market? I think part of being really efficient and thinking about your engineering efficiency is moving this out of the silo. You don't want to just be in a silo of engineering, and engineering has a lot of clarity as what's going on, but it feels like sales or marketing or product don't. You want to be able to communicate all of this right stuff. So the main thing that I would measure is literally your investment distribution. What are the things you're investing in? How much are you investing in each and every single one of those? And as you're investing in that, is that where you want to be? Does the rest of the business agree with that? Does the rest of the business disagree with that? That doesn't necessarily mean you have to change it. But making sure that you're transparent with it and you're able to have those conversations and debate on something that's a little bit more hard data than it is a guess of, hey, we planned on having these 5 people, the story points tell us that, but maybe we don't necessarily know.
Yeah, cool. And what are the different metrics that you'd collect at those different levels, I guess?
Yeah, so at the organization level, I'm pretty much always collecting, where are we spending our time? Right? Are we spending our time and effort? Which are the projects we're spending our time on? How much time and effort are we spending on, growth or new feature development, whichever one you want to think of it as well as how much time am I spending on, redone iterations, maybe tech debt pay down, something in the, a little bit less of the, hey, this is a brand new thing that we're going to market like crazy, and this is something we're going to make better. It's really similar when you start to look at this. I think of teams in 2 ways. One is like the project team. This is the team that is actually working on a particular project and trying to ship something to market. And there's also the organizational team. Like, what's the engineering team that is going to be working together, not just on this project, but kind of in perpetuity going forward. At the project level, I'm looking at really similar stuff as to the organization level. How much am I investing in the project? How focused am I on that project? Are the people working on that project focused on that project, or are they working on other things that I might be worried about, or they might be getting distracted by, or having their focus split across? And then how fast am I getting it done? So how much am I growing the scope of that thing versus how much am I burning it down? And generally in the early stages, you want to be growing the scope faster than you're burning it down. In the later stages, you probably want to be burning it down faster than you're growing the scope. At the team level, you should be looking at kind of the operational efficiency and operational effectiveness of the team. So this is where you can start to, if you use the superpowers for good, this is where you start to use things like, how fast does the team get issues done? How fast does the team get epics done? How fast do they merge PRs? How effectively are they collaborating? But I think when you start to look at that at the team level, like, this is a really sharp double-edged sword, right? You can start to measure a lot of things on the team level. But if you're just measuring a number for a number's sake and you don't have an outcome tied to it, that's where it gets really, really dangerous. So as an example, like, I've seen a lot of teams say, like, we want to measure story point velocity, right? Easiest thing in the world to game. And if we do 5 more story points a week or a month, or maybe 15 more a sprint, what does that actually get us as a business? Does that mean we get a product or a project out a bit earlier? Or does that really mean we just inflated our story point estimates and we're chugging along just as we did before? Whenever you're looking at something on the team level for efficiency purposes, I'm always thinking about, what is the thing? What is this going to get me? What is the outcome? And what is the superpower that I'm trying to encourage along the way? And I see like comment from Ben, like, story point velocity as an arbitrary planning mechanism, definitely not meant as a metric of project progress or value. I can't agree with you more on that. I've seen a lot of times where, the classic, the Dilbert example, where people are, using story points, and it's sometimes the best we have, but also probably not the best we have anymore.
Yeah, definitely. I think from a story point, from my perspective, if you're not, that can be, you can understand how many things are kind of moving through a process, for example, but if that doesn't relate to the value that you're creating at the end from a product perspective or a customer perspective, then it doesn't matter how many story points you're doing. So yeah, it's very important to align to the value that you're creating in the team.
Yeah. One of the things that I like to think about instead of like story points, as like, the raw number of things that we're getting out, is really what you're trying to do is you're trying to have a fast iteration, right? You're trying to figure out how much you're learning and you're trying to get things out to your customers fairly quickly, right? So as you're measuring things, what I'd be measuring instead of story points is like, what is the number of iterations or what is the number of things that we put out there? Some of them might be successful, some of them might not be, but the more things we put out there generally, the better off we're going to be, because we're going to learn from all of them, and then we're going to be able to continue down the correct path. That's good agile practice.
Yeah. Okay, great. And what indicators, metrics, or KPIs would be helpful to identify shifts in efficiency?
So like I talked about before, I think iteration rate is probably like my number one thing for looking at in terms of shifts of efficiency. If I'm delivering less stuff to the market, I want to know why. It's not always a bad thing. Like maybe I'm working on a big project, maybe I have more confidence in it, maybe I have to migrate my databases over, and that's like just a monstrous thing that is obviously going to take a lot of time. But the instant I see my iteration rate fall, or the number of things that I put out into production fall or grow, I'm asking, what does that mean for my efficiency? That's usually a good sign that my efficiency is improving or decreasing. The other thing that I like to look at is rate of bugs. And when I say rate of bugs, I mean that as more of how many things are my customers finding and how much time am I spending on things that my customers have noticed are broken. Namely because that's a real bleed on efficiency. The more bugs, or the more you get distracted by things, the less efficient you are, the less you're going to be able to put out there, less you're going to be able to focus on what really matters. On the flip side, if you go too slow and you have very, very few bugs, you're probably not learning nearly fast enough. So with rate of bugs, you want to find the baseline and then decide, is that an acceptable baseline? Do our customers complain about our quality, or is this just part of doing business and we feel pretty good about pushing the needle as quickly as we can?
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful metric, actually. We started in my most recent place looking at time spent on support issues, which I think is a similar kind of piece in terms of understanding how much of our capacity are we spending on this feedback that we're getting directly from the production environment. Yeah. That'll help us get a baseline at least, and then we can work from there.
And in all honesty, like I think the orgs that do this really, really well is time spent. They do this via time spent, not necessarily just raw count. Raw count makes it really easy. Like, hey, this was green instead of blue. You could file and fix those bugs all day long, and it might take you 5 minutes per bug. Versus if you have a really, really tough, hairy bug that takes half the team, a few weeks to figure out, that's a much bigger bleed on your efficiency, and that probably is a little bit more indicative that maybe our quality needs to be a little bit better.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so how does team health and engineering operations play into creating a more efficient team in an uncertain macroeconomic environment?
So I think in an uncertain macroeconomic environment, like team health and having strong team health and really strong engineering operations are even more important in this macroeconomic environment. Like in a macroeconomic environment, like challenges are heightened, right? Like everyone's concerned, everybody's just generally less efficient just because of what we see going on in the world today. We see, Google laying people off and Facebook laying people off. The healthier you can keep the team, like the happier the sentiment, the better you can retain them, the better you can create a sense of psychological trust and psychological safety. That's going to make an outsized impact during this time of uncertainty. And a good way to do that is and a good way to see that if you're doing that is via strong engineering operations. And when I say strong engineering operations, I don't mean like being on top of the team and saying like, hey, please fill out your ops report every week and tell us how many PRs you merged and how many bugs you fixed and whatever else. Like that feels a little bit too micromanaging. On the flip side, you want to be able to have metrics at a distance. You want to be able to get them from the systems that the engineers are using themselves without them having to deal with really, really aggressive project management.
Yeah.
And as you start to collect those metrics and understand like, hey, this metric kind of is a good indicator for this team of whether we're collaborating effectively, which is a really important part of being on this team, or this is a good measure of whether we're shipping things effectively, then you'll be able to start to detect early those kind of shifts in team health. Like maybe somebody's disgruntled and they're looking to leave, and all of a sudden you're going to see a drop in collaboration or a drop in effectiveness for the team by whatever measure you use whatever way you measure effectiveness. And it'll be a good chance for you to address that or figure out how can we make this a little bit better and deal with a little bit of the uncertainty in the environment.
Yeah, definitely. I think anything where you can collect the metrics and the data in the background without involving too much of the team's time, it definitely probably contributes to team health in terms of happiness. If
Right.
you keep asking for reports or data on certain things.
I can say from my own experience as a product manager, like the fastest way that, a former leader got me to shut down was by asking every week, hey, how many story points did you do this week? Like, well, I can go get that number for you, but I don't know how meaningful it is.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. What can you measure to not only show your team is maximizing resources and the people in the team, but also continually improving their progress?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, because I think it falls into two parts again. Like when you're measuring things to maximize resources and improve process and operations, you have to decide what improving process and operations actually is. You kind of have to start with the strategy that you might have for that particular team. Maybe it's really important that that team does a lot of things really, really fast. Maybe that team is working on a really critical part of infrastructure, and it's more important that they get it right than they do it fast. So improving process and operations is, to start with that, you actually need to start to understand what it is you want that team to do, or how you want that team to achieve or accomplish their goals. I think, in order to the things to specifically measure, I think for speed, it's all about how long does it take us to get something out to the customer or out into production, or whatever way we consider something deployed. If you're looking at quality, again, rate of bugs or amount of time spent on bugs or amount of critical, E-down type incidents caused. If you're in a more traditional sprint team and you're really looking to ship products to customers, especially in a time of uncertainty, I really like to focus heavily on process and transparency to my stakeholders. I want to be able to give my stakeholders confidence that we're going to hit the things that we want to. And in that case, I'm measuring things, externally, like how many epics are we delivering, how many things are we delivering on time, and internally, I'm measuring things like my sprint completion rate, and not just my sprint completion rate, but my sprint predictability. How much did I do? How much did I commit to at the start of the sprint? How much did I plan on and tell my stakeholders I was going to do? And how much of that did I actually get done? Doesn't matter if I got different stuff done. Did I get the stuff I originally told? And maybe if that number or ratio is off, like we either have a stakeholder problem where they're asking us for a bunch of different things, or we have a focus problem where, we keep on getting distracted by other things. And now all of a sudden, whatever we tell the stakeholders, they can't trust because they're getting something completely different at the end of every single 2-week iteration. And I think like when you look at all of these, you think about the end of the month, you don't necessarily want to be measuring this every single day, right? Your needle's not really going to be moving that quickly on how fast you get things out to production, or how many bugs you put out into the field, or how well you're being transparent with your stakeholders on a day-to-day basis, or even a week-to-week basis. I always like to think about doing this at the end of the month, or doing this on some regular cadence where I can actually see the impacts of any of the process changes that I've made. And the last thing I'll say with those specific metrics, it's probably not worth looking at it in terms of like, hey, our sprint completion rate or our sprint predictability is 50%. That's terrible, and we need to get better. It's probably more worth saying, like, we're at 50%. How do we feel about how the team has been doing qualitatively first? If we think the team is doing well qualitatively, like maybe we don't worry about it being 50%. Versus if the team isn't doing well qualitatively, maybe we push that up to 60, 70, 80%. You can do the same thing with bugs or story points. It's much more about establishing that baseline, understanding how you feel about that baseline, and then making changes that don't necessarily drive towards a specific number, but drive towards a specific trend. Are we getting better? Or are we getting worse?
And would you normally involve the team in understanding those metrics in terms of what you choose, what is most relevant for the type of team that they are?
Absolutely. I think, generally engineering hasn't done a ton of this before, but with, the Agile Manifesto, with Agile metrics, like that's kind of like the first try. And a lot of times they haven't been implemented super, super well. But because it's the first time, and because engineers have a strong opinion and it's a creative discipline, the best way to get the team involved and on board is have them participate in selecting the metrics. Help them figure out what is our superpower as a team. What do we feel like we do really, really well? And how do we measure that? And how do we measure the fact that we're not going to lose that over time? In the same way, as you're working with the team, what are the things that we feel we want to get better? And let the team crowdsource those ideas for you. And then let the team start to decide, hey, this number seems like a good proxy for that. If we make this number better, we theoretically should get better at that. Let's go out and try to do it. And the more the team is involved, kind of, this is again a double-edged sword. If it's kind of top-down push without much consultation of the team, that's a really quick way to make the team feel unsafe and ultimately make it unhealthy and affect your retention rate to an extent.
Yeah, I agree. So just going back to some of the people, like the team metrics again. So what are some of the potentially the internal ones that we might look at in terms of from a staffing point of view?
That's a great question. I think internally within the team, we talked about all of the kind of like how many story points or how many PRs do we merge, as long as you're using those well. I think one of the things that's probably underutilized right now, and it's probably more important to utilize internally to the team, is sentiment and kind of team happiness. Because I think right now, retention rate is really, really key for your business. Everybody doesn't have headcount. As people leave or as people don't stick around the company, all of a sudden it's impossible to backfill that. So it becomes twice as important to make sure that you keep the people that you have, even if it was important before. Sentiment is probably the best leading indicator of that. The more you can start to understand how happy the team is, what they feel like they're struggling with versus what they feel like they're doing well on, as well as like what their likelihood of sticking around is, the better off you'll be, just because of being able to retain the people that are really making a contribution and are ramped up on your tech stack and software. Even if you had headcount, it's still a 6-month lead time to get somebody new in the door and get them contributing at the same level as somebody who's been there for a bit.
Yeah. And how are there common ways in terms of how people might collect sentiment from the teams?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Are there quite common standard ways in terms of how you collect sentiment from the teams?
So I actually think this, like the collecting sentiment from the teams, has historically been done via one-on-ones, right? I think we all think it's important, or at least I always think it's important to have a one-on-one with every engineer that that reports to me, or every one of my directs, and do our skip levels and whatever else, to make sure that the sentiment is good, or try to understand the sentiment. I think there's a new suite or batch of tools out there that help you collect sentiment and ask questions. Like there's survey tools like Lattice. I think also like being able to have the perception or kind of understand the sentiment in a lot of the code level stuff that's going on is always really important. Like one of the best indicators for one of my former engineers was the instant he stopped writing comments in code because he was frustrated or annoyed, was a really good indicator that he was kind of ticked off and I should go talk to him. So wow. I think there's a lot of newer ways to come out, and I'd be really interested to see what the space does around collecting sentiment over the next few years.
Yeah, that is interesting. Okay, so I think we touched a little bit on communicating with stakeholders, but how can you continuously provide that transparency? What does it look like?
Yeah, I think when you can continuously provide transparency to stakeholders, like I think it's really, really basic. You just want to be communicating early, often, and really, really simply, and focusing on the thing that the rest of the business or organization cares about. Like, as an example, like we have lots of metrics in engineering that are really similar to, if we draw a parallel between engineering and sales, like imagine sales, when they're doing things well, or when they're communicating to the rest of the business well, they're not talking about how many meetings they're booking or how many emails they're sending or how much outbound they're doing. They're talking about how much pipeline have they generated and how much have they made their number, right? What is our forecast? What's our commit? What's our best case, et cetera, et cetera. For engineering, you can simplify it down just as much. It's what are we working on and when are we actually going to be done? And the more you can bring kind of hard numbers to that fight, as opposed to a finger in the wind, the better off you're going to be. I think actually this is a good question from Dave, where he's asking a little bit about how do you actually measure this when you're thinking about time spent? Are you going as granularly as time sheeting, or are you thinking about team sprints or equivalent as a unit? That's a really good question. I think there's a lot of different ways to measure this. I certainly don't recommend time sheeting. That's something that we all would fill out at the end of the week, take an hour to do it, and probably be wrong. Team sprints is probably like a slightly better proxy to that. In reality, I think there's a lot of tools out there, and full transparency, Jellyfish being one, where they'll analyze the data coming out of Jira and Git to understand where the team is spending the time. And if you have, if you're able to start doing that and you're able to really make some clarity with the teams, if here's the things we care about spending time on, like help us understand where you're spending that time. It becomes a lot easier when you use an external tool as opposed to trying to mine the data out of Jira. I did the mining data out of Jira for the first few years of my career. It wasn't fun, and we did it a lot less often because we had to put so much effort into mining the data out of Jira.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, thanks for that. So I know if we're looking at, so we talked about communicating with stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
What about aligning with like business objectives and how you can do that, how you can make that visible to your teams, but also kind of the two-way connection?
Yeah, so I'm a really, really big fan of making an effort to tie your engineering effort back to your company OKRs or strategy. Like if you have company OKRs, if you have some form of strategy doc for your company, you should be working hand in hand with product as kind of one R&D organization and tying all of the work that you're doing back to any of those particular OKRs and being transparent about how that work being done relates to company business objectives. A really good example for us at Jellyfish this year is we're trying to become more efficient as a team and as a company. So every single thing that we're doing from an R&D perspective is all about becoming more and more efficient. Number one, like we spend a ton of money on AWS. We're doing some work to cut down on that. And we can very easily tie that back to the company objective of be less efficient. Turns out we had some tech debt that was kind of sticking around that made it harder for us to clean up the AWS bill. So part of cleaning up that tech debt also linked back to focusing on that OKR of cleaning up, of becoming more efficient. And the nice thing about engineering, and if you start using some of these metrics, is they can actually become part of your OKRs or layer into your OKRs, right? Like the key part of OKR is not the O and the O objective, but it's the KR and the key result. What's the thing that we're measuring? For us, it was pretty fantastic. We had a goal of we want to reduce our AWS spend by X number. I'm not going to say a number because it's really embarrassing. But with the tech debt, we also managed to set a key result of, we think that once we clean up this tech debt, we're going to be able to go X% faster. We're going to be able to merge PRs X percentage faster. Once we clean it up, can we measure the impact and the results of that and see if we actually achieve that key result across the board? But the more you can kind of layer down from the top down of here's our company strategy and here's how the engineering work we're doing fits into it, the more effective you're going to be with kind of showing impact across the business.
Yeah, definitely. And do you find that the engineers are more bought in and aligned based on that as well?
Absolutely. Like I think one of the hardest parts about there's always jokes about internal tools teams or whatever else where they're kept in a back room and they only care about writing code. The more you can align it to company OKRs, the more they feel like they're empowered to do work that actually achieves that OKR. The more you're linking to that, the more you'll get kind of the side benefits of, hey, I see this thing over here that's like really small and would be done fast, but actually is going to really help us out with this OKR. Let me just go and do it because I'm empowered to do it because I care about the OKR, not necessarily the project that I've been handed or the task that I've been given.
Yeah, definitely. That's great. I mean, I've definitely experienced in past roles where you've kind of, if you have that disconnect between the goals and engineering, it's hard to prioritize what's happening in engineering if it's not linked to the business goals as well.
Absolutely. Like, and we see it all the time, right? Like as a product manager, a lot of times product is saying like, oh, this is the priority, that's the priority. Because we have some level of context, like the fully realized version of a one engineering and product organization is, with these OKRs, with linking our engineering work back to our OKRs, all of a sudden it means that everybody has that context, and product's role shifts from dictating priority to helping people understand the context of everything that's going on, and really reduces the lossiness of communication. If you're making multiple hops, right, you're starting at engineering and you have some lossy communication to product, who has lossy communication to sales, and who has lossy communication to marketing. All of a sudden you've lost a whole bunch of valuable information and valuable context. And if we're going for efficiency, lossiness is probably bad, right? We don't want to have lossiness all the way through.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we talked about the useful metrics and KPI. What about the ones that aren't really relevant and don't really convey efficiency?
So I could talk about this for probably 15 minutes, but like when we look at KPIs or information that we communicate to engineering stakeholders that aren't relevant or aren't efficient, I think of these as vanity metrics. And I think the dangerous thing about metrics is any metric can be a vanity metric if you use it wrong or in a performative way. And that means like you don't have any particular reason to use that metric, or you don't have any particular reason on why you're using that metric, but you're using it anyways, right? I think and you might have bad reasons for using that metric. Like Salesforce the other day, and maybe there's someone from Salesforce on the call, like went in and made some layoffs based on lines of code written. One of our best engineers actually has a point of pride that his code contributions at one of his last companies was negative, or overall his net code contribution was negative. He's like, I removed more from the code base than I actually wrote. Yeah. And that's a really good thing. I probably would have gotten him fired at Salesforce. And like, that's a really good example of a vanity.
That's crazy, isn't it? If we're looking at, simple, well-structured code, that kind of goes against the like lines of code.
Right. I mean, like, maybe betraying my generation. Like somebody sent me a TikTok the other day where somebody had written 1,000 lines of code with just a single increment function to beef up and get to 75% code coverage so that the tests would pass. And I think like, having metrics like that or vanity metrics really, really incentivized the wrong behavior. And I think, things like anything can be a vanity metric, but I see lines of code used as a vanity metric really frequently. I see commits used as a vanity metric really frequently. And if you're measuring story point velocity as something to improve over time, like, hey, we want more story points, we want more story points, we want more story points. That's a great example of a vanity metric as well.
Okay. So what's the best way to identify that you might be using something as a vanity metric?
So I think there's lots of different ways that we can identify that we're using something as a vanity metric. I think, the number one thing that says that you're using something as a vanity metric is you're focused more on the number than the story that the trend tells, right? Again, like, if you go back to Salesforce, they're just stack ranking people by number of lines of code. Like, okay, that's focusing on the number, not the story the trend tells. Like if I was using something different, like let's say I was using PRs merged or I was using PR comments, I'd actually want to look at that and say, hey, what does the clusters look like, right? Like if who has the most PRs merged? Is it my senior engineers? Is it my junior engineers? Who has the most PR comments and PR reviews? Is it my senior engineers? Is it my junior engineers? Is it a particular team? Is it a particular group? What's the trend? Are we getting better at this or are we getting worse at this? If we're not asking those types of questions, we're probably using something as a vanity metric. And maybe I'm like, I'm going to say this over and over again because I think it's probably the most important thing to focus on. As we're looking at as we're looking at metrics, like the most important thing is to have an outcome identified as to what are we hoping to get out of using this metric. Like I split like the outcomes that my team focuses on into 6. Like 1 is alignment, 2 is speed, quality, process, hygiene, and collaboration. Whenever I look at a metric, I try to decide which one of these things does this fit into. Story points, as an example, fits into productivity, and I want to keep that productivity number consistent or constant. Like I don't want to see that trend change because I know that the more that trend changes, the more we would be crunching, or the more we might be recovering from a crunch. So if you're not thinking about the outcome that you've associated with a particular metric, or you don't have a good sense of the outcome, that's probably something that that's likely to be used as a vanity metric.
Yeah.
And especially, go ahead, Anna, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say whether you thought that having silos within teams actually can increase the number of vanity metrics. If we look at the example of QA, for example, a classic metric used to be like number of bugs closed or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
it wasn't kind of embedded in the team. It was because there was that handoff and they were measured differently from the whole team, and there wasn't a common outcome. They had a very different kind of outcome for their silo than the whole team. Absolutely.
Like if you look at that, like we actually had a separate QA team at my last company, and the QA team was just constantly opening bugs sometimes for the sake of opening bugs because they were gold and incentivized on how many bugs did you open for the engineering team to go out and fix. And like that was very performative, right? Like we're just opening bugs for not necessarily for no good reason. Maybe there is a legitimate bug there, but we're opening tons and tons of bugs, and it's a toss up as to whether there's actual customer value in that bug or not, or if it's just us being QA and typing in a lot of really weird characters into an input form.
Yeah.
And the more that you silo, the more that each team is going to pick the metrics that make sense or that matter to them, and the more that it's likely to look like vanity metrics to another team, right? Like it's super, for a QA team to see who's working hard, like especially if it's a siloed QA team where it's only QA, like maybe it makes sense to the QA team. They say like, hey, the harder we're working, the more bugs we're going to open, or the more diligent we are, the more bugs we're going to open. So we should measure ourselves on that. And then all of a sudden the engineering team turns around and says, all these bugs don't matter. Like they don't matter to the business. They don't matter to the product that we're making. And it looks like a vanity metric. Same way with engineering, right? We see, we've reported story points to external stakeholders before, like our sales VP doesn't care at all about story points, but we tell him that, and he says, well, it seems like it's going up, but I'm still not getting the stuff I want. Like that feels like a vanity metric to me. So kind of similar kind of course.
Yeah, I think it tends to sink a lot of time as well, doesn't it, when you've got those silos, because you're going through those loops of raise bug, check bug, triage bug, not an issue, back,
Right, and in like a macroeconomic time of uncertainty, like it's super important to not have those like inefficient loops, right? Like the more you have those inefficient loops, the worse it probably is for the business. And the more that you have kind of like these vanity metrics and lossy communication, the less efficient the business is going to be at the end of the day. Like, engineering and sales are all play just as much of a part in, making sure the business survives during these economic conditions and thrives. And as you're going through the work that you're doing, like part of delivering things to stakeholders on time allows the business to just be more efficient. Like if you're measuring on-time delivery and you feel like your stakeholders have really good confidence in your ability to deliver on time, well, they're probably going to be more effective in terms of selling because they're going to be able to tell customers what's coming sometime soon or what's coming reliably, whether that's your sales team or your marketing team or your growth team. And the more that you can have metrics that kind of apply across the whole business, whether it's what are we working on or whether it's how fast do we deliver things, the more likely it is your business as a whole will be efficient with the help of engineering and product.
Yeah. Have you used something like waiting time as well? Because I guess that can sometimes be an interesting metric to understand that end-to-end piece.
Absolutely. So I think within the team, like when you start to look at things like how long does it take us to ship and deliver things, like looking at it at a high level, like how long does it take us to ship and deliver things is just the start of actually understanding all of this information, right? We can say, hey, it takes me 20 days, pick an arbitrary number, for me to deliver something to production. Well, what does that actually mean? Did we decide to do something and then spend 10 days waiting to do it and then actually ship it out to production later? Did we actually decide to do it 50 days ago and then we spent 30 days waiting and then we started measuring when we started working on it? So we actually released a recent feature called Lifecycle Explorer that explores this. So shameless jellyfish plug. But also, I think it's interesting because we start to think about internally, what's our refinement time? How long does it take us to figure out what it is that we actually want to do? How long does it take us to do the work on that? How long does it take us to review it and like feel good about it, that we can put it in production? And how long does it actually take us once we've made that decision to put it in production, right? If we're not a CI/CD company, thankfully we are, it could take up to 6 months to get something into production if we do 6-month release cycles. And more important than that is like, what are the gaps or what are the overlaps in that process? Like it's probably a good thing if there's a little bit of overlap between, figuring out what exactly we're going to do and actually starting on the work, right? We can explore it, we can iterate on it faster, we can make sure that we have the concept right. Versus if we're looking, if we're sitting and waiting for a very long time in between deciding what we want to do and actually starting on the work, like we've probably forgotten about all of that context. Or if we've gotten it done and we're waiting 6 months for it to get put into production, again, like that's just lack of efficiency. That's wasted time. That's something that we could actually be way more efficient as a company and as a business.
Yeah, totally agree. Great. Okay. Was there anything, just before we put out to some questions, Milan, was there anything else that you wanted to cover that we haven't touched on at all?
Nothing necessarily. I'm really curious to hear from the audience. Like, what questions do you have about, like, namely transparency, or, what metrics to measure? I know we covered at a high level, like a good number of KPIs, and I spent a lot of time talking about, like, it's not just the KPIs, but it's the story you tell with that. So I'm really interested to hear from the audience. Like, what questions do you have about how to measure these things, or what to measure based on, what challenges or what outcomes that you're trying to drive?
Okay, great. So I think we've got one question. I'm not sure if we touched on this one before, but we've got, what common factors would you say affect perceived predictability of sprints?
Yeah, so perceived predictability of sprints, I think in my mind, there's two. There's internal team chaos, or there's external team chaos. Internal team chaos is, we do a bad job of sprint planning. So we decide, hey, we're going to do these 50 story points, exactly these specific ones at the beginning of the sprint. And then, a couple days into the sprint, a week into the sprint or so, we realized, oh crap, we planned badly. We should have had this. We should have had that. We should have had this other thing. And these things have come up that means that we need to change our whole sprint. That's an example of, like, the team just forgot about roadmap work, or the team wasn't strong enough in prioritizing tech debt work, and all of a sudden it's that they knew about, and all of a sudden it's causing problems. And like that happens all the time, right? Like, we're humans, we forget about things. We don't always remember exactly what it is we need to prioritize, and we sometimes discover new information. The discovery of new information, or, like, external stakeholders, I think of that as external stakeholder chaos. So external stakeholder chaos is, a good example of support. Support comes in and just blows up our sprint because there's a critical incident, there's a critical bug, and we need to put all hands on deck and go fix it right now. And the way that I always like to think about that, or that I always like to understand that, is I start to look at, what is the amount of time spent on support? What is the number of things that were requested or asked from us, if I'm not sure where the divide between the two is? So, as you kind of hear from the team, like, there's a little bit of sentiment there, but there's also a little bit of data exploration of, hey, like, we blew up our sprint 4 times in a row. What's happened? I will say, like, it tends to be more consistent. Like, it'll happen every single sprint if it's internal inconsistency, where, like, the team is just not the greatest at planning, or needs to improve on their planning. If it's external, you'll get it might be frequent and might be constant, because maybe that's just the nature of the team's work. But you'll see a few sprints in there where the team has done a good job of planning, and, like, really knocks it out of the park and does exactly what they said they were going to do for the course of that short sprint. I mean, that's a pretty good way to identify it usually.
Yeah. Okay, great. So here's a good one. This has been relevant to some conversations I've had in the past. So what do you do if the CEO and CTO disagree on the most important metrics, despite multiple conversations to reconcile this? So CEO might want speed, CTO might want quality improvements.
That's a great question. Conversations to reconcile this. Like, I think, like, on either, there's two ways to do it, right? And Anna, like, you've been a CTO before, so I'm sure you've had this conversation before, so you can add more color and context. I think there's the conversations to reconcile this are probably the way forward, but bringing hard data to both of those conversations is critically important, right? If the CEO wants speed, like, it's really important to understand, why does the CEO want speed? Is it because the CEO is concerned with time to market? Is it because the CEO is concerned that we're getting beat by the competition? Is it because the CEO is concerned that our customers are deeply unhappy with us because we haven't shipped enough things to them? While the CTO might want quality improvements, because that'll enable those specific things. And the more that you can, bring hard data to that, like, a good example of this is, we actually had, like, the tech debt conversation we had before. We've had numerous tech debt conversations. I've had CEOs or GMs that never wanted to pay down tech debt. If we were able to do a little bit of tech debt work, I could actually point to a measurable performance improvement and a measurable quality improvement, because we did that tech debt work that wasn't necessarily improving on the things that the CEO wanted. And because I knew what was going on within the team, I was able to bring hard data to that conversation. If I couldn't bring hard data to it, I felt like I was, beating my head against the wall. The CEO is never gonna listen to me, because he's got an OKR, or he's got pressure from the board, or she's got pressure from the board, and we've got stuff, and they feel like it needs to be speed.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand a little bit more about what they mean by speed as well, because there's like immediate speed over like long-term predictability and delivery. So I think it is definitely the data, it's the conversations. There's obviously trade-offs. You might want to do or need to do something very tactically quickly and have to make some trade-offs around the quality. But also involved in that conversation is, what is the impact of doing that? Are you adding to tech debt? Is it going to block something later down the line? Are you going to have to then change the roadmap, and actually your growth trajectory after a certain point would actually slow down? So I think it's understanding those immediate trade-offs to try and unblock that, what is the speed, but also what is the value at the end of it in terms of what's the return that you'll get back from every piece that you do. Cool. I've got any more questions? So there's one that I've just wrote down here potentially. So you talked a little bit about like measuring the end of the process. So that deploy piece. And I guess there are still organizations that might work on a 6-monthly release or quarterly release, haven't quite had that CI/CD type journey. What are the kind of metrics and KPIs do you think they should be measuring to start optimizing that process?
Yeah, I think there's two, right? Like, and I worked in an organization that didn't have CI/CD, and we had 6 months. It took us 6 months to get something in the hands of our customers. I still think it's important to measure how long it takes something to get into the hands of our customers, even if it's 6 months, even if there's a deliberate choice there, just so we know that it does take 6 months, and we can be transparent with our stakeholders about the speed of light. Essentially, like, our speed of light is always going to be at least 6 months. We can't go any faster. With those organizations, though, I think it's also really important. Part of the reason you deploy early, often, frequently, isn't just because you want to get things out to your customers quickly. It's because it de-risks a lot of the work that you're doing. And for de-risking that work, essentially, all these people are working on all these different things, and you're hoping they merge together successfully, and you're hoping they merge together in a good way. It's really important to make sure that you're still measuring how long does it take us to kind of cut a good build CD or cut a gold build that we feel is good. So when we've merged a PR, how long does it actually take us to have a new build of the software out and available and ready for, maybe it's QA, maybe it's for beta testing, maybe it's for internal testing. My last company, like, we were a big enterprise company. I always had access to early builds because I was part of the team that was making demos. So do we have the ability to make demos out of that thing? I think, like, measuring the amount of time that it takes before that is available for somebody to try to use is still really important, even if you're not on the CI/CD path. Maybe the somebody isn't a customer anymore, but the somebody is your internal stakeholders or yourselves or whoever else.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, great. Right, we've got one more question here. So that's from Tam. Thank you. How do the important metrics change as a business moves from discovery to first launch to longer term maturity?
So I think the main important metric that changes as you move from discovery to first launch to longer term maturity is where you're spending your time and effort. And I think, with where we spend our time and effort, when you're early on in the business, like, there is no reason that you should be spending pretty much any time on kind of tech debt pay down or support, because you're just doing discovery work. You're trying to figure out new things. You're trying to do things for growth, new feature development, figuring out the right thing to do, experimenting, iterating, whatever else. As you move towards first launch, now all of a sudden it's a bit more important to start to pay down some of those tech debt items you cut, or deal with support that you might have. So as you're dealing with that support, you're going to start to, as you're moving towards first launch, you're doing stuff for new feature development. You're doing the stuff you need to for the launch, but you're also going back and you're cleaning up the stuff that you knew you cut a corner on to see if it worked with the customer. And then when you're in longer term maturity, you should be looking for a good mix or balance of all three. You have to make sure you're spending time on support and your customers are happy. You have to make sure you're still pushing the product forward, but you have to have, like, a constant stream of maintenance and tech debt. Like, we all have to upgrade versions of packages or versions of software or tools that we use. We have to make sure that we continue to do that. On the efficiency and optimization side, I think a big piece of what you actually want to be measuring is the earlier on you are, the faster you want your cycles to be. because you just at the early stages, you have a lot less confidence, and speed is the most important thing. As you're doing discovery, the faster you can learn, the faster you can figure out what the right thing to build is. As you're working towards kind of your first launch, or as once you get past initial discovery and you're working towards your first launch, speed becomes a little bit less important, and it becomes a little bit more important that you focus on quality and collaboration, making sure that everybody who's working on the thing knows what you're moving towards, and knows how to work with one another. And if I'll go slightly off topic here, if you've heard of the pioneer, the town planner, and the pioneer, settler, and town planner model of engineers, like discovery is all about pioneering. We're trying to build new stuff. We're trying to do brand new things. First launch is all about settling. Let's make sure that like it's a little bit repeatable, it's a little bit scalable. We still have the ability to fix things or go fast as we need to, but we're laying the groundwork and we're laying the foundations to be able to have a town here. And then, once you're in a longer term maintenance, you're looking much more at your quality. You're looking much more at your collaboration. You're looking much more at your consistent throughput of, are we consistently making changes to this? Because that's when you need a town planner. That's when you're saying, like, we have a bunch of streets, we have a bunch of houses. We need to make sure that as we build or add new things onto this, we're doing this efficiently, effectively, and we're not, we're not demolishing houses to build a new road. So when you focus on that, you should be looking a lot more at what's our quality, what's our overall productivity, what's our throughput on this, as well as like what are the specific, how much time do we spend on support and bugs? Like, do we have to keep on fixing the piping every other week, or are we able to make longer term, more wholesale changes of like, hey, we need to resurface all of our roads? Like that's about time we do that. I'm really liking the city metaphor today. I don't know why.
It's a good one. Okay, I mean, we've probably got time for one more quick question. If anybody's got anything, let's just check the questions. There's nothing in the log. No, I mean, we have covered some ground today. That's been great, Milan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, cool. What I'll do is I'll just pop your LinkedIn details into the chat so that anybody that wants to make contact with Milan can do that, if that's okay.
That's great. Yeah, happy to.
Yeah, and I'll also put the next CTO crafts. So next time, I think it's the 17th of March, so that's in a couple of weeks. We're going to be joined by James Conway Finn, who's going to be talking about crafting excellent onboarding processes. So there's more details in the chat for anybody who wants to sign up to that. But yeah, once again, thank you so much for your time, Milan. That's been great. And thanks for everybody, and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care, folks.